Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, the third part really for today, the 23rd of October 2025. We're going to look at the general geopolitical news surrounding the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with a post here from Geo Insider talking about how France's top general, Fabien Mandon, has warned lawmakers that the French armed forces must be ready within 3 to 4 years for a potential shock or test from Russia, marking one of the starkest assessments yet from Paris. The Russians are reorganizing with one goal in mind: to confront NATO, Mandon said, adding that hybrid attacks already underway could soon turn more violent. His remarks align with growing warnings across Europe from Germany, Poland and the Baltic states that Moscow may directly test NATO defences before 2030. France's tone has hardened in recent months, with President Macron declaring that Europe is now in a confrontation with Russia. Over to me now. I agree with this in light, in respect that Macron has hardened his stance, and we've seen that from Friedrich Merz as well, and actually from Keir Starmer to a degree. All of them are being very direct in their claims that Russia are the bad guys, and we need to be very careful. We are effectively at war with Russia, or at least Russia is at war with us. And Mandon stressed that Europe must prepare collectively, saying rearmament itself is a form of deterrence. If our rivals perceive that we are making this effort, they may renounce. If they feel we are unprepared, I don't see what could stop them. And on that happy note, we move on to Zelensky today, meeting with the leaders of Czechia, France, Poland, and Germany, indeed, as well. European leaders are meeting in Brussels, and Zelensky is there. So there's quite a bit to be said. I mean, all the usual things. There are posts coming out about him meeting with those leaders and then talking about air defense and all the normal things. I'm not going to go through those kind of generic nuggets. There are a few details to discuss, though. We're going to start with Belgium reportedly pushing to soften EU summit conclusions on using frozen Russian assets for Ukraine. According to Bloomberg, Brussels wants a European Commission to study how such a mechanism could work rather than draft a legal proposal right away. Always lots of talk with regard to frozen Russian assets and how best to use them. And Belgium has quite a big say in this because most of the money is stuck in Euroclear in Belgium. So that's why they're particularly concerned. Now, Zelensky has come out and said in sort of press briefings that or sort of press conferences here that in regards to what Trump said this morning and yesterday, or I reported on it this morning, he was saying yesterday that Wall Street Journal had claimed that the US had lifted restrictions on missile usage, and that's why Storm Shadows were able to be used, because the US had lifted restrictions. Trump came out and denied that, saying, look, they're European missiles, we don't have a say. But the reality, as I reported this morning, is that EUCOM and SACEUR, so the American forces in, or the American officer corps hierarchy in Europe, and the NATO, under the NATO guise, there are the ones responsible for making those decisions. Now they've been taken away from the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and actually Trump does have the ability to stop Storm Shadows being used inside Russia. And I discussed all of that this morning because there's quite a lot to say in terms of whether restrictions had been lifted or not from Biden previously lifting them, but then it looks like decisions were made on a case-by-case basis, and it could be that now the US leaders in Europe have given a green light to Ukraine to use weapons like Storm Shadow in Russia without having to individually go through and ask Pete Hegseth or Trump or whatever. Anyway, there's all this controversy. No one really seems to know what's going on. Least of all Donald Trump, because I don't think he really understands the mechanisms at play here. So Zelensky responded to the Wall Street Journal article about the alleged lifting of restrictions on strikes on Russia. Quote, "We have never used American weapons for long-range purposes in Russia. I've used the ATACMS, but actually they're not really long range by the definition of the ranges there. They're kind of medium range missiles. We have used various weapons with good capabilities, but this was strictly in the territory of combat operations. In other words, they've used ATACMS and they've used them not deep into Russia. In fact, the Bryansk strike using Storm Shadows the other day was only Bryansk. It was only just inside Russia, really. I mean, the oblast is a big oblast, but, you know, the question, I guess, is, you know, when does it become deep into Russia? What defines a category change between, you know, striking legitimate targets inside Bryansk or Belgorod or Kursk, and then anything beyond that? Is it just the boundary changes of the oblasts? Is it the definition of medium range and long range? ATACMS and even Storm Shadows. So it depends what Storm Shadows they're using, whether they're the export variants that have a shorter range. But if they're, you know, 300 kilometers worth of range, is that actually a long range weapon? Is it being used deep into Russia? I'd argue no. And so, you know, there's a lot of language that is being leaned on in these statements, I feel. So Zelensky says China helps Russia, but does not help Ukraine, and it is not interested in our victory over Russia. We have sanctions on Russian energy. We don't have a meeting in Hungary without Ukraine, and not yet Tomahawks. That's it. This is the result. I think it's not bad. In other words, sanctions good. Tomahawks not yet, but might happen. No meeting in Budapest at the moment. In fact, we heard from Medvedev this morning that the meeting is not happening. He kind of admitted that. And we're also hearing from Putin. He said that the Russia-US summit is likely being postponed, calling it, quote, a mistake to go to Budapest without preparation. Trump, meanwhile, said the meeting was cancelled because, quote, it didn't feel right to meet. Then we have Putin saying that Tomahawk strikes deep inside Russia would be an escalation that would trigger, quote, a very serious, staggering response. So he's really kind of rattling that saber again, isn't he? He also called new US sanctions, so the two sanctions on, well, the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, but actually all their subsidiaries mean that there are sanctions on all sorts of different entities. Anyway, he added that no self-respecting country acts under pressure. So he's, you know, really having a go at the US there. And on that note, China opposes the US sanctions against Russia's two largest oil companies. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun said, quote, China always opposes unilateral sanctions that have no basis in international law and are unauthorized by the UN Security Council. Dialogue and negotiation is the only viable way out of the Ukraine crisis. Coercion and putting pressure on others does not solve the problem. Well, I think they do solve the problem. He also added that China firmly deplores the UN sanctions against 12 Chinese companies accused of helping Russia circumvent sanctions. Does he mean UN sanctions or US sanctions? Anyway, that is an interesting position, completely predictable. Of course, dialogue doesn't stop Russian troops from attacking Ukraine. It really doesn't. Like, you need to put force on Russia. Russia needs to be forced to stop. That's the only way of getting them to stop. They will not willfully stop if they're given strong words of, you know, in situations of dialogue, right? Now, let's think about these sanctions. There are kind of two approaches. One is that they're really good, and we're going to look at the impact they've had. But we're going to start with the negative here before moving on to the positive. Negative here is provided by Phillips O'Brien, who is a military historian and sort of strategist and whatnot. In fact, he's got a book called The Strategist. He's written a Substack piece saying the new US sanctions move actually protects Russia for now. So he goes against the positivity from a number of people. He says, however, if I were to tell you that what actually happened yesterday was that the sanctions that could really damage the Russian economy were put off for at least the next 4 weeks, and even then no commitment was made to implement them, what would you think? For that is a reality. Instead of 2 weeks, in the case of the Trump administration, in this case, the Trump administration has provided some protection to foreign companies, like think Chinese, Indian, Turkish, who are buying and refining lots of Russian oil until at least November the 21st, 4 more weeks. What was sanctioned yesterday was US firms and individuals that deal with two large Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, which together handle the flow of about half of Russian oil. Here is a Treasury announcement. He links, it looks pretty damn impressive until you get to the small print. What you will see is that these sanctions are not automatically applied to foreign individuals or companies. The words used are may result in and run the risk of being sanctioned. See bold below. So, quote from the press release from the US Treasury Department says, violations of US sanctions may result in the imposition of civil or criminal penalties on US and foreign persons. OFAC may impose civil penalties for sanctions violations on a strict liability basis. OFAC's economic sanctions enforcement guidelines provide more information regarding OFAC's enforcement of US economic sanctions. In addition, financial institutions and other persons may risk exposure to sanctions. Again, may risk exposure to sanctions for engaging in certain transactions or activities with designated or otherwise blocked persons. In addition, foreign financial institutions that conduct or facilitate significant transactions or provide any service involving Russia's military-industrial base, including any persons blocked pursuant to EO 14024, run the risk of being sanctioned by OFAC. For additional guidance, please see the updated OFAC, blah, 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 blah. So Phillips O'Brien then says, so what this order really does is sanction US companies and individuals that work with Rosneft and Lukoil, and maybe it makes it more difficult for those firms to transact in US dollars. However, the US does almost no business with either Russian firm, and for the last 3.5 years, the Russians have become expert at transacting oil sales without using US dollars. So these immediate sanctions are at best mild irritants. The real power of such sanctions would be if the US put secondary sanctions on foreign companies that are buying oil from Rosneft and Lukoil. However, not only are secondary sanctions not mandated in the order, just threatened as above, it turns out that the earliest that even the threats could be acted on is November the 21st, more than 4 weeks from now. All firms are being given by the USG until 21st of November to wind down their business dealings with the Russian companies. And what happens on November the 21st, you might ask, well, nothing definite. That's the earliest now that the US government could conceivably level secondary sanctions on foreign firms, but the US is under no obligation to do so, so on and so forth. So he's saying it's not nearly as strong as people might otherwise think. But the positive here is that, and maybe some of these entities haven't really looked at the elbow room that the sanctions press release or details might give them, because actually China and India have changed, it appears, their behavior already, or are looking to do so. Tendai here says Chinese state oil companies have suspended purchases of seaborne Russian oil, as reported by Reuters. This comes after the USA placed Lukoil and Rosneft on the sanctions list. So Chinese state oil majors suspend Russian oil buys due to sanctions, sources say. A bit more detail here. No report says China's state energy giants Sinopec, PetroChina, CNOOC and Sinochem have temporarily halted new seaborne purchases of Russian oil due to fears of US sanctions, says Reuters. The pause highlights the growing impact of Washington's latest measures on Russian energy exports. Okay, so things are changing, one could conclude, given these reports. Oil prices, though, have risen by more than $1 per barrel on Thursday, extending gains from the previous session after the United States imposed sanctions on Russian oil companies Rosneft. According, again, to Reuters, Brent crude futures were up by $1.76 or 2.81% at $64.35 by midnight, basically GMT last night. And US West Texas, its intermediate crude futures were up $1.68 or 2.87% at $60.18. Okay, so that's that. Then we hear, so Jakub Janowski reacting to this. Analysts say things like, I expect that if both India and China significantly reduce the import of Russian oil and or require more measures that obscure the origin of the oil, which costs money. And that's a really important point. I'm going to sidebar this, is that even if they do find ways around this, it's going to cost. Like, doing business with Russian hydrocarbons entities will cost more money now. The finding loopholes and trying to work around these issues is not as efficient as just buying this stuff straight up off them. I've said this to you before about widgets as an example. So if you are a US company wanting to sell widgets to Russia, you've been sanctioned, you can't sell those widgets to Russia, or widgets have been sanctioned. So you go, okay, right, I'm going to sell them to these people in the US, and these people are going to sell them to these people in the US, and they're going to export them to Kyrgyzstan. That's going to export to a dealer there, or maybe to Malta, and then to Kyrgyzstan. And someone in Kyrgyzstan is going to sell that to someone in Belarus, and then someone in Belarus sells that to someone in Russia, and then Russia gets a widget, right? In all of that process, every single entity, and I might be exaggerating, but every single entity takes a cut. So by the time the widget gets to Russia, it's like twice as expensive as it should be. So yes, Russia is able to buy that widget, and it's coming from the US in this case, in my example. But successfully finding those loopholes or ways around the system is an expensive pastime. So yeah, Jakub Janovsky says, I expect that if both India and China significantly reduce the import of Russian oil and or require more measures that obscure the origin of the oil, which costs money, and or demand higher discounts, it could relatively quickly start hurting the Russian budget. So if they still continue to buy the oil off Russia, say, right, we're going to be hit by these sanctions or whatever, this is going to cost us so much. Therefore, if we're going to continue to buy this off you, you have to sell it to us even more cheaply. Has to be even cheaper than it was. Okay, well, we were already really struggling with the price point, and now it's going to hurt even more. So whatever happens, Russia will be hurt. So yeah, okay, Phillips O'Brien, might have a point here, but I think the good news is it's looking like behaviors have changed, and it will be, I think, costly for the Russians, at least somewhat. So we'll have to wait and see, I guess, over the next couple of weeks. Now, Shashank Joshi says, credit where it's due. Trump has shifted from words to action. India's top refiner is looking at halting oil purchases from its biggest Russian supplier following Donald Trump's sharp escalation of US sanctions on Moscow, according to the Financial Times. And this from Reuters, Chinese state oil majors have suspended purchases of seaborne Russian oil, blah, 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 as we've heard. Quote, the US sanctions, quote, mark the most material move to date by the US to shutter the Russian war at ATM. Halima Croft, head of global commodity strategy for RBC Capital Markets, wrote in a note to clients. If the Trump administration does indeed back today's words by action, we anticipate that refiners seeking to retain access to US capital markets will forgo Russian barrels. The other encouraging aspect of this is transatlantic coordination. Quote, over the past month, European and US officials have been working together on how best to pressure Russia's economy. A European team was in Washington on Wednesday when the Treasury made the announcement. And that had been the case before when the Europeans went over to the White House previously. There were teams over there sort of working on how best to work together with the United States. So maybe these working groups have come, their work has come to fruition here. Quote, before this week's move, Russia's oil and gas revenues were already projected to decline to around $100 billion this year from nearly $135 billion in 2024, largely as a result of the lower price of oil. Rosneft alone contributes roughly 10% of total federal revenue, according to Yanis Kluger, analyst on Russia's economy and deputy research group leader at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. I often draw from Yanis Kluger. So there are some good signs here. Yeah, fingers crossed these sanctions will work. And of course, then, as I mentioned this morning, you've got the European 19th package of sanctions that focuses on LNG and cryptocurrency. So as I said this morning, EU is introducing a complete ban on the import of liquefied natural gas from Russia in 2 stages. Short contracts expire in 6 months, long ones on the 1st of January 2027. The EU bans all transactions with Russian crypto platforms and services that help circumvent sanctions through cryptocurrency. Intermediary banks under sanctions. The restrictions affected banks in Kazakhstan and Belarus that carried out crypto operations for the Russian Federation, and sanctions affected 4 Chinese companies that help Moscow circumvent financial restrictions. It's minus one more way to circumvent. Now the EU is blocking Moscow not only oil and gas, but also shadow cryptocurrency. So that's good news. Now, aside from sanctions, okay, let's put that to bed for the time being. In other news, 3 alleged Russian intelligence agents have been arrested in London. According to the BBC, London police believe they were working for Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. They are known to be 48, 45 and 44 years old and were arrested in West and Central London. Bit more detail here from Liz Webster. 3 men have been arrested in London under suspicion of assisting a foreign intelligence service linked to Russia. Counter-terrorism police described the suspects as proxies, intermediaries operating on behalf of hostile state networks to influence or disrupt UK political processes. While the government denied interference, its own police are now arresting Russian proxies in London. Brexit's architects build a state so hollowed out that hostile actors could move in. These arrests proved that Westminster refused to face Westminster refused to face. The breach began at the ballot box. So obviously someone linking this to Brexit in this case. Okay, so 3 men arrested there for spying in London for Russia. Then we have Carol Cadwallader, who is doing great work in trying to connect or investigating connections between say reform and Russia, but also other aspects of Russian interference in the UK. Now, one of the issues has long been that the previous government refused to publish the report into Russian interference in the Brexit referendum, an EU referendum. And that has been pretty controversial for many, because it looks like they're trying to cover up the extent of the Russian interference there, because they think it would undermine the vote itself. So Carol Cadwallader has been looking into this. New Russian interference case heads to the Europe's Supreme Court. So former MPs Caroline Lucas for the Green Party, Ben Bradshaw for Labour, he was Exeter, I think, MP, and Alan Smith, I can't remember who that is, where he was, with all the citizens. So that's the citizens who expose big tech and founders of oversight organisations and whatnot, take a landmark case to the Grand Chamber. So the case claims that the UK government is in breach, or probably the former government, in breach of the law for refusing to investigate foreign interference. It's pretty extraordinary timing in a case that's been running since 2020 and the publication of the Russia report. As Gill pleads guilty to taking Russian bribes, so this is Nathan Gill, the former reform leader, why is the UK government still refusing to investigate Russian interference? Interesting. So it looks like the present Labour government is still continuing to not want to investigate, maybe because they don't want to relitigate or be forced to, or have to think about relitigating Brexit as an entire vote and movement. Carol Cadwallader says, firstly, please, if you can, support this, crowdfunded to support this case. We spent years on this. The MPs are persevering, even though they've now left Parliament, and the whole subject couldn't be more urgent and more timely. The case stems from the systemic failure and subsequent cover-up revealed by the 2020 Russia report. Boris Johnson refused to investigate, but what is the UK government's excuse now? So they have, she's written a piece on that, so I might need to look into that. And then we have more connections in the UK, connections to Russia, and in this case with reform again. So Nathan Gill, Richard Tice, who's the leader of reform until Nigel Farage came back and then took over leadership. He's a deputy now. Richard Tice has declared a £1,400 gift from Mrs. Chernikin as accommodation in France. No mention of travel costs, to discuss gas power. She is a wife of Vladimir Chernikin, former Putin minister with no history of expertise in gas power. A bit of background on the Chernikins. So he went, I think I reported recently, he went on holiday with them and this year in August, and that is highly dubious. In 2022, the BBC reported on a very wobbly story involving Mrs. Chernikin, who she disputed that she was ever a director of a real estate company called Radlet Estates linked to Suleiman Kerimov, a sanctioned Russian oligarch also close to Putin. She claimed her signature was forged. She now appears as director of a newly created entity called Satellite Energy Systems UK Limited, which focuses on net zero solutions. The owner of the company is her husband, Vladimir, the former Putin minister. He declares residency in Italy as per Companies House. A Swiss publication focused on money laundering revealed that both Kerimov and Chernikin used offshores and Swiss lawyers to buy luxury properties in the same place, Cap d'Antibes. That's where Richard Tice went on holiday, where Tice, joined Chernikin. Did Tice get to say hi to the Kerry mods for us? So again, you just got to be wondering. There needs to be investigations into, I think, Reform, Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, obviously Nathan Gill, and their connections to Russia. Nathan Gill's taken money for pro-Russian propaganda. What is going on with these other people? Okay, I talked to you about that Europol smashing of the Latvian bot farm that wiped out 50 million fake online accounts. Absolutely incredible. So Adrian P, who is, I think, Romanian, or certainly reports on Romanian stuff, documentary filmmaker, Romanian patriot with a Ukrainian heart. Yeah, there you go. Adrian P says, what happens when 50 million troll farm accounts get wiped out? A pro-Russian Romanian fascist loses 32,000 followers and whines about it, blaming the services. You gotta love it. Real Europeans don't support Russia. Only a fringe minority of loons do. Real Europeans support Ukraine. Okay, so this is a guy, a sort of right-wing ultra-nationalist, it appears, in Romania, suddenly loses 32,000 followers. And is it right that, do I understand this correct? He's only got 742 now. He literally loses his entire following like that, rather conveniently at the same time as 50 million fake online accounts are smashed, right? Really incredible. So, yeah, from nearly 32,000 followers to 742 friends in a second. Plus, they blocked me so I can't post at all anymore, he says. Blaming how the social media site works or whatever, whereas it's much more likely that he lost them all because they're all fake accounts. Okay, going on to more kinetic Russian threat. Russia, using Western technology, has created a secret system to track NATO ships in the Arctic. An international investigative project called Russian Secrets has found. The system is called Harmony. It is a network of underwater microphones, sonar, and other technologies designed to detect NATO submarines. The system increases Russia's ability to detect Western submarines and allows nuclear submarines to enter and exit ports undetected. To create Harmony, Russian firms imported technology and vessels from 10 European countries, as well as the US, Canada, and Japan, at least until the autumn of 2024. Moscow significantly strengthened military infrastructure on the Kola Peninsula and in Murmansk, that's a sort of northern area around Finland, a region from which Russian missiles can reach both Europe and the US. So that's where we're talking about, and lots of sort of sonars and microphones placed in the water there. So interesting stuff. Right, we're going to go to Georgia now. So Justin closing the road at Rustaveli. I say Justin, this was from yesterday. Closing the road on Rustaveli is now criminalized. So Rustaveli Avenue is the main area where they are consistently protesting every single day. They're trying to do the kind of Euromaidan thing here. But now the authorities have said if Rustaveli is closed, it's now a criminal offence. The regime police went further and began abducting people from the pavement to put them in jail. This is absolutely horrible. In fact, here we have a woman here, journalist Laika Basilaya Shavgulidze. She was abducted to be jailed off the pavement only because she told the regime police, you will be punished for everything you do. More than 20 people have been detained and counting. They are picking off loads of people. And I was wondering if they are just going to start incarcerating everybody, whether everyone just goes out on to protest. But of course, this is your livelihood, isn't it? Your dependents. Can you do this? Because you will go to jail. So what about if you've got kids and blah blah blah? But the idea, like in principle, you could come up with an idea whereby enough people get jailed that basically society stops functioning. Not enough people go to work, and then you have people, who are members of the police, internal security services, prison services, are having to incarcerate their own family members. It's that what's the percentage that was famously said? Something like 3.8%. If 3.8% of the population start overtly protesting, then it leads to the fall of the 3.5% maybe, or something like that. Then it leads to the fall of the state, because there are that many people that they're all connected to everyone in government and everyone in the police forces, and et cetera, and it all becomes all too difficult. Yeah, here we have a young woman in Tbilisi standing on a police car while Georgian Dream fills prisons with peaceful protesters. The people fill the streets with courage. Fear is gone, dignity has taken its place, says Terje Helland. This is where what defiance looks like when a nation refuses to kneel before repression. The question is, how long can that go on? Are there enough people to continue protesting there? But it's good to see, as well as it is sad to see. It's good to see that there is still that courage there and the desire to protest against the repression of the Georgian Dream pro-Russian dictatorial government. Okay, and then we're going to come on to the spat between Radoslav Sikorski, the foreign minister for Poland, and Peter Szijjártó, the foreign minister for Hungary. Okay, so there's been another spat between these two. Hungary's foreign minister Szijjártó has mocked Poland's foreign minister over the ICC and Nord Stream. So, okay, situation. Nord Stream gets blown up. The Polish and the Germans, is it? Or no, the Italians refuse to extradite people to Germany to face trial. And this is seen as quite good because it could implicate Ukraine. It could be very difficult to navigate that politically. And then the ICC is the International Criminal Court. Hungary are members of the, they are signatories to the Rome Statute, which means that if there's an ICC arrest warrant, as there is on Putin, then if you're a signatory, you have to arrest whoever has an arrest warrant on their head, which would be Putin. So if Budapest is going to be the site of Putin and Trump meeting, then Hungary have to do something about that. Anyway, these two things meant that happening has caused a spat between these two, and not for the first time. Right, so Szijjártó is mocking Poland's Sikorski over the ICC and Nord Stream, questioning Poland's refusal to extradite a terrorist who blew up the pipeline. Sikorski fires back, calling the act of sabotage against an invader, and praises Hungary's own major Magyar for targeting Russia's oil lifeline. And in fact, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to come to Radoslav Sikorski here saying, Peter Szijjártó, I'm proud of the Polish court which ruled that sabotaging an invader is no crime. Moreover, I hope your brave compatriot Major Magyar, so Robert Brovdi of Magyar's Birds, finally succeeds in knocking out the oil pipeline that feeds Putin's war machine, and you get your oil via Croatia. I will love the time that Magyar blows up your pipeline, the Druzhba pipeline, and then you have to get your oil not from Russia but from Croatia instead. Now, speaking of Hungary, we have had these protests, or it's not a protest march, it's actually a pro-government march. It's the opposite of a protest march, it's a propaganda march, put on, as it is, I think, every year by, in this case, the Orbán government. In Hungary, pro-Orbán demonstrators marched on Republic Day, chanting, "We don't want to die for Ukraine." That's actually what that banner says there. We don't want to die for Ukraine. So you've got a whole march whose premise here is anti-Ukraine, or, not supporting Ukraine. And waving national flags, protesters carried signs rejecting support for Kiev, reflecting growing anti-Ukrainian sentiment among the Hungarian far right. Derek Taylor says, because we're going to keep seeing images like this the first part of the day, it is important to keep in mind that this is a regime-organised march, and it will almost certainly pale in comparison with the anti-Orbán march scheduled to take place later in the day in Budapest. So that's interesting, and watch out for the counter march there. But yes, certainly looks like. I wonder how many people are there actually. It'd be interesting to see an aerial shot of that. Because it looks like this is going to be that is a substantial march, but actually you can't tell. If that's only 20 people deep, then meh. So that's your pro-government, anti-Ukraine march taking place in Budapest, but there might well be an anti-march taking place later, anti-protest. So here we have Budapest marking the anniversary of the 1956 anti-Soviet revolution with two major rallies. So Orbán's peace march, led by a banner reading "We won't die for Ukraine," has ended. Okay, so which is really interesting because it's actually an anti-Soviet, Republic Day. We are protesting against, or we're feeling nationalistic, remembering, what happened in 1956, so on and so forth. So Orban's peace march, led by a banner reading "We won't die for Ukraine," has ended. Now opposition leader Peter Magyar's national march heads with supporters towards Heroes Square. So I guess we'll have to wait and see who got the better of it in terms of numbers there and PR. Okay, Serbia will not be able to join the European Union unless it aligns with Europe's sanctions against Russia, the European Parliament has ruled. Quote, Parliament underlines its firm commitment to Serbia's EU membership prospects, under conditions that measurable progress has been made respecting democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights, as well as a full alignment with the EU's common foreign and security policy and sanctions against Russia, the resolution states. MEPs, members of European Parliament, also pointed to anti-EU and pro-Russian propaganda in Serbia carried out by government-controlled media and officials. This is really good. So Europe is getting hard on support for Russia. If you're serious, Vucic in Serbia, if you're serious about joining the EU, you cannot be supporting Russian propaganda through your communications, essentially, and you have to agree to sanctioning Russia. MEPs also pointed out that government-controlled media and officials. The European Parliament resolution calls for free and fair elections to be held in Serbia. Okay, so yesterday I talked to you about the precursor, possibly, for the sanctions being placed on Russia by the US, was that the US Senate was preparing 3 bills that all act as blows against Russia. So the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is set to approve 3 bills today aimed at increasing pressure on Moscow, Axios reports. The first designates Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism over the abduction of Ukrainian children. The second imposes sanctions on China for supporting Russia. And the third allows the US to transfer frozen Russian assets to Ukraine every 90 days. The initiatives were introduced by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, Amy Klobuchar and Katie Britt. Interesting Katie Britt's there because she's quite a MAGA. She was the one that gave the what's it, Active Union? No, there's what's it called? The Union speech. State of the Union speech. So Biden, when he gave the State of the Union speech, wasn't Katie Britt that was sitting in her kitchen giving like the MAGA alternative? So it's good to see her as that kind of person supporting these initiatives. Meanwhile, the Senate has postponed consideration of a separate bill to toughen sanctions against Russia until after the Trump-Putin meeting. Well, that's not going to happen now. So how about you put that one forward as well? Now, the Russia sanctions bill had enough US Senate support to pass easily, but Trump's long call with Putin and his plans to meet him in Budapest made GOP leaders pull back. So that's that tough sanctions bill, which I presume would be the Lindsey Blumenthal actual bill, their one. The bill is on hold until Trump decides if talks will be fruitful. Well, I don't think they're going to happen now. So yeah, get it back online. Okay. This is a sort of annoying conversation that you hear oftentimes when these wingnut MAGA types regurgitate Russian talking points. This is on CNN.
Zelensky right now is he does not have any cards. His one card is the question of how long the American people are willing to keep funding this war. And the answer to that is
the American people are not funding the war now. I mean, shall I show you? Here it is. Shall I show you this? The US is no longer in the democracy game. If the free world wants to stay that way, they better stop relying on US weapons. Well, military aid allocations to Ukraine. January to June 2025, that's this bar. More stuff has been given this year than last year. And last year was about 50-50 US and everyone else. This year, it's about, 5% US? Everything else is European. And July to August, load has been given there, actually. As considering July to August weren't very, it's not a large part of the year. Look how much is given. And all of it by, almost all of it by European NATO countries, is mainly Europe, obviously the US as well, and then other donors as well. So that's a really significant counter to what she is saying there. Anyway, let her carry on.
They are done with this. And so Donald Trump has to try to figure out how to get both of them to the table. Now, the failed liberal model of diplomacy suggests that when you have a weaker party and a stronger party, what you do is you bolster the weaker party, you bring down the stronger party, you create this artificial parity, and then they'll negotiate. It never works because you take away everyone's incentive to negotiate. The weaker party doesn't want to negotiate because they've been elevated, and the stronger party doesn't want to negotiate because they've been brought down. Trump's view is the exact opposite. He is a real estate guy. He says the only way you get to a deal is you exacerbate the power differential, because then everybody has an incentive to come to the table. I want to make one more point. When this war began, Crimea was part of Russia.
No.
Ukraine was not part of NATO. And the Donbas region, Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk were independent republics. There was a civil...
No, they weren't. No, they weren't. They were... Oh, my goodness. So... we'll come to this.
War there. They were not part of Ukraine. And the idea that this ends and that territory that...
The war started in 2014, not 2022.
When this began,
there was a Russian-backed insurgency to take control of
Ukraine. That's just that's never going to happen, and everybody knows that. So this will never end when everyone's living in a fictional world that is not going to bring an end to the killing and the death.
Oh, Jesus. Right. Okay. So lots of people going to town on this. Including Michael Weiss here. The war began in 2014. Crimea was illegally occupied by Russia and remains so to this day, as acknowledged by multiple acts of Congress and the Crimean Declaration issued by the State Department under one Donald J. Trump. Any Russian claims on Crimea as either a democratically certified breakaway region or Russian annexed region should reckon with the testimony recently given by former FSB Second Service Officer Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Fodotov to Insider, saying, quote, the majority didn't want these changes, not in this form, meaning that when people say that all of Crimea wanted to return to the motherland, that's not true. People were told Crimea will become part of Russia in any case, and those who didn't go to the polls will be placed on a special record. My colleagues from the FSB literally used the phrase, quote, we gathered the people, drove them to vote. The so-called independent republics were not independent, nor were they republics. They were and are sovereign territories of Ukraine, which were invaded by Russia in 2014 using former and current Russian intelligence operatives, conventional soldiers and mercenaries, and featuring heavy weapon systems. One of these, the Buk anti-aircraft platform, downed MH17, killing nearly 300 people, a crime to which a Dutch court convicted in absentia an ex-FSB officer and an ex-GRU general, both Russians. Batya Ungar-Sargon has apparently written a book about fake news, and so imagine my disappointment to find she devoted no chapter to herself. Right, let's talk about the Pentagon. So the Pentagon, well, Pete Hegseth came out with this declaration that anyone who wants to report on the Pentagon, on the armed forces of the US, has to have their writing approved by by Pete Hegseth, effectively. The reason why mainly this came about is because there have been all these leaks supposedly from the Pentagon, and he wants to stop leaks from happening. And so you're not allowed to report from the Pentagon, where you have desks inside the Pentagon, you have press desks inside the Pentagon. You're not allowed to report from the Pentagon. You're not allowed to speak to anyone unless you've had that sanctioned by the powers that be, which is of course against the freedom of speech principle, First Amendment, and essentially all of the major news outlets refused to sign up to this, including Fox News and including Newsmax. It was only OAN, who are super right-wing. They're the only, and they're not even mainstream, but they're becoming a little bit more so, as you know, they're fed into people's algorithms and whatnot. Anyway, OAN signed up to that, but virtually no one else did in the American media landscape, at least no media outlets of repute. So the Pentagon is barring almost all Defense Department personnel now as well from talking to Congress or state lawmakers without prior approval from the agency, according to a memo signed by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. They don't want us to know that they are likely killing innocent people in international waters. So with the whole bombing of boats, Hegseth has stopped Pentagon personnel or Defense Department personnel from being able to talk to Congress or lawmakers without prior approval. Wow. Right? Then you've had all of these, and this is a picture of all of those news outlets leaving the Pentagon. So they cleared their desks. We're not allowed, or we're not going to sign up to this dictatorial move from Pete Hegseth. So the following outlets are no longer credentialed at the Pentagon: the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, NBC, ABC, Reuters, Fox, right? None of them signed up to it. But the following outlets are now credentialed instead. Lindell TV, so that's Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, who is like Mr. Trump 2.0. Tim Pool, the pro-Russian YouTuber that was given press pass for the White House. Jack Posobiec, pretty similar guy, right-wing influencer. Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's organization. Gateway Pundit, the National Pulse, and the Post Millennial. These are all like horrific people and organizations. Here, Brian Tyler says the Pentagon announces they are replacing the New York Times press credentials with My Pillow Guy's media outlet. That's how desperate, how poor things are. And well done for Fox News, by the way, for going along with this. Now, this is Jack Posobiec, and this is the Pentagon press secretary who is... I reported on her, if you remember, back when she was nominated, and she is like pro-Russian shill, anti-Ukraine, like she is bad news. But she's a guy selecting all of these wingnuts, and it's all so horrific. Pentagon press secretary tells MAGA influencer Jack Posobiec that they are excited to welcome incredible journalists like him and 60 others to the Pentagon.
It's fantastic news, and we're so proud to have Human Events and over 60 other journalists that are going to be joining us here in the Pentagon. And you talked a little bit about the previous Pentagon press corps. They walked out because they refused to sign an agreement that was simple. It was common sense. It said, wear a visible press badge, don't go in classified spaces, stay in the correspondence corridor, and follow the building's rules. They refused to do that. They
and get what you're saying signed off by the Pentagon.
Reported. That was their right, but also their loss, because now we get to have incredible journalists like yourself who are going to be here in the Pentagon reporting on what the Department of War is doing every single day. It's really the next generation of journalism at the Pentagon, and we're so excited for this new era and this new generation. I think we saw President Trump use this on the campaign trail so well, right? He didn't have to rely on the mainstream media's corrupt filter to get his message out. He went to independent journalists, he went on podcasts and alternative news networks where he was able to speak directly to the American people. That's exactly what we hope to do here at the Department of War, and we're really excited to welcome this new group of 60 plus journalists. It's all.
They are not journalists. These are YouTubers and influencers and right-wing ideologues. They are not journalists. This is a real debasing of the journalistic sector. And indeed, so Shashank Joshi, the defense correspondent from The Economist, said, here's a sample piece of journalism from one of the news outlets that signed the DoD rules. I don't know which one this is, whether it's Jack Posobiec himself or whoever. Welcome to the new press corps. And this reads like not even a decent blog. This reads like a Facebook post giving adulation to dear leader type thing. At the heart of this stands Secretary Hegseth, whose tenure has been nothing short of transformative. He has solved the terrible Biden recruiting crisis that was a ticking time bomb for our national security. By the way, as an aside, that was already being solved from February last year as the recruitment numbers were going up, and that was under Biden. Anyway, Secretary Hegseth has boosted active duty numbers by 15% in less than a year. Americans are excited to serve again because they see real leadership, not the dog-costumed leadership running DoD under President Joe Biden. By the way, that's an incorrect use of semicolon, but never mind. Of course, you would know that because you're a good journalist. Even more than this recruiting success, just look at Secretary Hegseth's leadership in the precision strikes against Iranian nuclear sites last spring. Executed with flawless coordination, these operations exemplified Hegseth's strategic acumen. We heard for weeks that if President blah, 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 blah. Okay, like that is what you're getting now from the press corps in Pentagon. Like, this is what you'd expect to see under a dictatorship, which is just obsequious reporting, fawning over the wonderful people in the Pentagon and the wonderful people in the US government. This is not freedom of speech. This is dictatorship. I'm sorry, it is. Now, talking about the Pentagon, there are cracks. The Washington Times came out, and this is what OSINT Defender is summarizing here. The Washington Times came out with a pretty controversial article detailing how military leadership under Pete Hegseth is not happy. You remember they were all called to that conference where Hegseth and then Trump spoke to them, and it was all kind of cringe. Well, major cracks are beginning to appear in military leadership under Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, with current senior military officers and current and former officials with the Defense Department telling the Washington Times that Hegseth has lost the trust and respect of some top military commanders as a result of the public grandstanding, widely seen as unprofessional, and the personnel moves made by the former cable television host, leading to an unprecedented and dangerous exodus of talent from the Pentagon. Numerous high-ranking officers painted Hegseth's speech on September the 30th to hundreds of generals and admirals gathered at Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia as a turning point in how his leadership style, attitude, and overall competency are viewed in the upper echelons of the US Armed Forces, with senior officials calling the speech embarrassing and theatrical to a degree that is, quote, below our institution. It was a massive waste of time. If he ever had us, he lost us, one current general with the US Army told the Washington Times. Okay, so that, you know, you put that together in the context of the dictatorial direction they're taking with regard to the press corps and everything else going on in the US government. It's a bit of a shit show, I guess. And as Shashank Joshi, again from The Economist, says, the Leahy law is being killed off. So the US State Department has removed an online portal for reporting alleged human rights violations by foreign military units supplied with American weapons. Again, this is, you know, you're getting rid of the JAGs, the military lawyers, and then a mere few months later, you're blowing up boats illegally in the Caribbean, right? In international waters. Someone challenged me on this and the legality of it. I did provide a really robust response, but taking from a couple of articles from Lawfare and Just Security, like I will argue very strongly that they are illegal, the strikes on the Venezuelan, Colombian boats, etc., etc. And now they are, so you know, you start removing the guidelines, or the guardrails, sorry, not guidelines, well, and guidelines, guardrails for the American military. You start allowing illegal stuff to happen, right? You start removing these portals online to report war crimes done by people using American weapons. Then it allows people to more easily use American weapons to commit war crimes. It's just like you're just allowing for this to happen. It's just like removing elements of the Constitution, habeas corpus, that paragraph about habeas corpus from the constitutional part of the US government website. You're like, okay, so you're now saying essentially, really, you're admitting that you can do things without due process. I just seem to have forgotten that one paragraph. How convenient. Well, I don't know if this definitely has anything to do with Russia, but I've told you about Jaguar Land Rover, one of our big car manufacturers in the UK, was cyber attacked, and they have been essentially knocked out for months. It's now the costliest cyber attack in UK history. The UK government has had to give them a massive loan. A cyber attack on Jaguar Land Rover will cost an estimated £1.9 billion and be the most economically damaging cyber event in UK history, according to researchers. They just completely knocked out the all the ways that the company could operate, you know, buying, ordering supplies, and, you know, the supply chain and building the cars, everything. Just the computer systems locked out. It's really interesting. I was listening to a cyber kind of warfare segment on BBC 5 Live Radio the other day, and the experts were saying, you know, one thing you need to do is have contingency plans, and actually, you know, you might need to have paper documentation for stuff. He said we were consulting with one company who they had this kind of geeky bloke who had insisted on keeping all of their designs, all of their model designs or whatever, molds, I don't know, whatever it was, keeping paper copies of them. Now he's like, which is really rare. This guy's like, no, he kept all these paper copies. Turns out they were cyber attacked and almost completely ruined, but for the fact that this guy had all the paper copies of all his stuff. And it's like, we could get these things made again because he had all the paper copies. So, going a bit old school is a way of mitigating. So anyway, I don't know if that's got anything to do with Russia, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. And I'm just going to read you this. I'm not patting myself on the back in it anyway, but these comments like this are lovely and they mean a lot. Just to remind you, if you were watching, I had a live stream the other night and talking about geopolitics. It was maybe 4 nights ago or something. It was a big geopolitical chat, and I was talking about reform probably and my political outlook. I was talking about actually conservatism and Trump not being conservative. And Hutch said, look, if it wasn't for Ukraine, I would be voting for Trump type thing as well. And then I said, well, actually, Hutch, I don't think you would, because not that I know you, but Trump is not a Republican. He's saying I'm a Republican. Trump is not a Republican. He's not a conservative, really. He's a right-wing populist. But actually, if you understand conservatism to be all of these things, Trump is actually not conservative. He's just ripping apart. He's not conserving the institutions, the buildings. He's knocking down the White House. He's ripping up the norms. He's destroying all the institutions of the American government, right? That is not conservatism. It's actually the opposite. And he said this, Hutch, and we had not a back and forth, but a little bit of a conversation there. And anyway, he said this, and I then had to go. And he said, look, I wanted to add this comment afterwards since you had to rush off. I immensely support your channel, not because I agree with everything you say, but because you disagree with me and make me think about my standings and positionings. But obviously I'm conservative, and your point on being a Reagan conservative was spot on. I wish we were closer so that we could go to the bar and I could buy you drinks and debate for hours, not just to debate, but to get me to truly self-reflect and say, am I being a moron about this? So for that, you have my support and I appreciate you. I love that. This is like my favorite comment for ages, because we are so easy to fool. The easiest person to fool is yourself, as Richard Feynman famously said. So we always need to be checking ourselves. The first person you should be checking is yourself and your own beliefs and your own thoughts and why you believe it. Actually, why you believe, not what you believe, is often a key to belief, right? And so hopefully what I do here, I have my beliefs, right? And I hope they're not inoculated, and I do question myself enough, because I talk about that with you guys an awful lot. But I just, this means so much to me that people, when they listen to me, do often question their own beliefs. And it's great that people listen to me who disagree with me as well. And I'm still not offensive enough to you guys that you still listen to me. And that means an awful lot, because I would like to have a broad church here, but it's difficult because I feel very strongly about stuff. And so, I often go off on one from my own kind of little ecosystem of thoughts, and that people like Hutch are still there listening. It means an awful lot. So thank you, Hutch, and thank you for that wonderful comment. In the meantime, guys, though, take care and question everything. Honestly, everything. Toodle pips.